All right, good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. Good morning to those of you on the West Coast. We will be getting started with the presentation in another minute or so. Just want to give some folks some more time to trickle in. All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? Good afternoon. My name is Ashley Hicks, and on behalf of the NFL, United Way Worldwide, and the Character Playbook team here at Everfi, I'd like to welcome each and every one of you to our first event in our Character Playbook Black History Month series, because Black history is American history. To the teachers and students who are already a part of our Character Playbook family, this event series is really meant to bring some of the concepts of Character Playbook to life through a different lens, showing how leaders in the past, present, and the future leaders in your classrooms use resilience, perseverance, empathy, and effective communication, among other concepts of character education and mental wellness, as vehicles for social change. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with Character Playbook and would like more information on how to bring the program to middle and high schools in your community, feel free to send us an email at characterplaybook@everfi.com, and we're happy to assist. Now, when it comes to civic engagement, 2020 was a historic year for America. We grappled with a devastating global pandemic that disrupted life as we knew it on many levels. We renewed conversations on social justice, race, and inequity after viral videos of African Americans killed by police sparked protests nationwide. And then there were the highly contested elections from local to presidential levels as Americans headed to the polls and their mailboxes en masse. In fact, so many Americans exercised their civic duty to vote in 2020 that if you're in middle or high school today, you may think that people from all backgrounds and walks of life in this country have always had the right to vote, but that simply is not the case. So in order to understand how we got to the unprecedented levels of civic engagement in the 2020 elections, we first have to understand the history of voting in this country and on whose shoulders we are standing on today. Our distinguished panelists will be providing you with a brief history of voting in America and the role that African Americans played in helping enfranchise many groups of people in this country. And now let's meet our panelists. Our first panelist is Justice Alan Page, who had storied careers in both the NFL and law. Justice Page was inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame in 1993. He was drafted by the Minnesota Vikings in 1967 and later played with the Chicago Bears. He was a six-time NFL All-Pro, the NFL MVP in 1971, only the second defensive player in history to earn this honor, and then was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 1988. Justice Page earned his Juris Doctorate from the University of Minnesota Law School in 1978 and is the first African American elected to the Minnesota Supreme Court in 1992, where he served until 2015. Most recently, Justice Page received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2018. Our next panelist is Janiah Hinds. Janiah is a teen entrepreneur and CEO of Slay It Proud, an apparel and content company that she founded at the age of 15 to share strong, positive messages about Black history. And our final panelist is Chris Draft. Chris is the founder, president, and CEO of the Chris Draft Family Foundation, whose mission has been to empower families to lead healthy lifestyles. A graduate of Stanford University with a Bachelor of Science in Economics, Chris played football and baseball and earned all Pac-10 honors as a linebacker with the Cardinal. He was drafted by the Chicago Bears in 1998 and played in the NFL for 12 years. And who better to lead this conversation than the curator of sports of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, Dr. Damion Thomas. Dr. Thomas, take it away.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here for this very important event. I want to start by having a poll. Want to see how much you already know about this important history. So let's go to the first question. The 19th Amendment gave whom the right to vote in America? African Americans, women, or 18-year-olds? Are there any panelists who want to chime in, maybe provide us with a little bit of help?
Women.
Okay, we got a couple more seconds before we'll see the results. Please get your votes in. %98 of you got that one right. Let's go to the next question.
I'm wondering how there's 98%, but then there was also 36% on top of that.
I think some people voted twice. We're still figuring out how this system works. Which of the following acts was signed into law in 1984? The Americans with Disabilities Act, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Missouri Compromise. Please enter your votes now. Chris, you got any thoughts about this?
Well, I have a little behind the scenes, so definitely I don't want to give away the answer, but I would say that there was a movement started by that a great man from Atlanta was a big part of that really helped this act get passed in Congress. So I'm just giving some clues.
Okay, Chris gave us a clue. You got about 5 seconds to get your answer in. And the answer is the Civil Rights Act, and 80% of you got that one right. The next question, which amendment grants you the right to vote at the age of 18? The 26th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 11th Amendment, or we have another entrant, none of the above. Please enter your answers. Janiah, you have any thoughts about this one you want to share? Any hints?
Well, I would like to say that and eliminate one of the answers so people can have a better chance is it would not be the 14th Amendment because it's saying that the 14th Amendment is for people who were born in the United States can be citizens and gave slaves the right to be citizens.
Cool. Okay, so you made it a little bit easier for us. 5 more seconds. "26th Amendment. And a number of you got that one right. It's a pretty smart group we have here.
Oh, yeah.
Which of the following were tactics used to prevent citizens from voting before the Voting Rights Act of 1965? I think I'm going to take this one, and I'm going to provide a little bit of help. The poll tax meant that you had to pay for the right to vote. One of the things we know now is that you don't have to pay before you can vote. So I just want to provide an explanation of one of the answers, and we'll see if that helps anyone.
Don't be misled.
Indeed. 91%, all of the above. That is right. I'm telling you, the teachers and students doing a great job here. Let's go to the last and final question. I know a number of you are in a position where you might get all of them right. So let's make sure that we finish strong. What qualities did leaders of the voting rights movement display that you are most interested in building or learning more about? Please enter your answer. Let's go to Ashley. Ashley, what are you most interested in learning about?
Well, I think I probably am most interested in learning more about the resilience that a lot of these leaders showed, simply because it can be hard to be denied something and continue to fight for it. So that's the one that I'm most interested in, but that might not be the only or the correct answer for you.
Great. All of the above. This was one of the questions where any of the answers would have worked. And I'm really glad to see that many of you are determined to learn more about all of these important qualities. It's really important. And one of the great things about the character playbook is that it really helps us learn about all of those important qualities. I want to spend a couple of minutes giving you a history of voting in America, which is one of the most important and central rights that we have here in the United States. And I want to start with the Civil War. The Civil War, which started in 1861, which was a war between the North and the South over the issue of slavery. And prior to the Civil War, African Americans who were enslaved could not vote. Women couldn't vote at the time. And the only group of people who were allowed to vote in the US were white men. Even among white men, there were some restrictions. In many states, if you didn't own property or homes, you couldn't vote. Sometimes people had to pay a poll tax in order to vote, but only white men could vote until the Civil War. So the Civil War happened, and then the North won the Civil War. And in the aftermath of the Civil War, a number of African Americans were free. 4 million African Americans were given their freedom after slavery had existed in this country since the 1600s. So now the nation had to decide, what do we do with this large population of people? And many people fought and argued that we had to give them their rights. We had to protect their rights. And that's where the 14th Amendment comes in, which is really important because it grants citizenship to anyone born in the United States, including those who were formerly enslaved. So that's really important because it helps to protect their rights. Another thing that happened after the Civil War was the 15th Amendment. And this is an amendment to the US Constitution. So this is a really big deal. We've only had 26 amendments. Then we had the 15th Amendment, which said that you could not deny people the right to vote based on race or their former position as being enslaved. That's a really important law as well. So then what happened? So I remember I said there were 4 million African Americans who were freed from slavery. Most of them lived in the North. Most of them lived in the South. The overwhelming majority lived in the South. And many of them were in states like Mississippi and Louisiana. And so there were so many of them that African Americans had a major impact on the vote in that particular state. So African Americans got elected to Congress, to governorships. At one point, there were almost 1,500 elected African American officials in the South. And so African Americans were exercising their voting rights, making positive contributions to society. And then we had the election of 1876. Some of you may have heard about this, where one candidate won the popular vote and the other candidate won the electoral college. One of the candidates was in support of African Americans having their rights, and one of the candidates was not in support. And so this was a contested presidential election. And people thought that the nation would go back into war. This is just 12 years after the end of the Civil War, 11 years after the end of the Civil War. And so people are thinking about, what is the nation going to do? How are we going to solve this crisis of who's going to be president? And so what ultimately happened is that both sides came together, and one side decided to give up their claim to the presidency if the other candidate would eliminate some of the protections that African Americans had that allowed them to vote and own property. And so in the aftermath of that election, African Americans lost a number of their rights, lost the ability to vote, and in some cases to own land. Now, if we remember, the 15th Amendment said that you couldn't lose the right to vote based upon race. And so there are all of these other ways that people use to restrict African Americans' ability to vote. One was the poll tax, which meant that people often had to pay in order to vote. There were literacy tests. Sometimes you had to demonstrate that you could read before you were permitted to vote. So there are a number of things that people put in place so that the rights of African Americans were restricted. One of the things that's important to remember about the 14th and 15th Amendment is that they only gave men the right to vote. And it's not until the 19th Amendment, which was passed in 1920, that women gained the right to vote. And it's largely white women who gained that right, because a lot of the other restrictions were still being applied to Black women and Native American women and other minority groups. Then people began to fight for these rights and to be included in the 1960s. We heard about the Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which eliminated a lot of those restrictions, the poll tax and the grandfather clause, which meant that sometimes you could vote if your grandfather had the right to vote. And so then African Americans gained more rights and opportunities to compete and for election and to have their voices heard in terms of the vote. And then we also have the 26th Amendment, which is really important. It's the last amendment that was passed, and it was passed in 1971. And it changed the age, the voting age. Prior to the 26th Amendment, you had to be 21 in order to vote. And this law changed it to 18 years of age. So now people are able to vote much earlier. And one of the reasons why this amendment was passed was because in 1971, a number of young African Americans and a number of white Americans and citizens of all races had been drafted into the army, into the military, and were fighting in the Vietnam War, but they weren't allowed to vote. And so once people looked at that issue, they decided to give younger people the right to vote and have a say in their government. And that's really important because it means that you'll get an opportunity to exercise your right to vote at a younger age. So I just wanted to share some of that history with you before we invite the other panelists back in to have a conversation about the history of voting. So I want to ask the first question. I'm going to direct this to Chris, but the other panelists, feel free to chime in and answer as well. Chris, what does the right to vote, this right and this privilege, mean to you?
Man, what a great question, especially following up after your just tremendous overview. I think if it wasn't obvious from just listening to the amendments that had to be added to the U.S. Constitution, that the idea of it being a right to vote was not just a right, that we had to fight for that we had to work for that. I mean, we look at women being able to vote, that's 1920. I mean, we're looking at only 100 years in terms of that. I mean, we're looking at from a Voting Rights Act that's 1964, that these things are right now. They're not that long ago. And then, I lived down in Georgia, and I think there were a lot of eyes on Georgia with the election, and how amazing Stacey Abrams, the job that she did down here in terms of not just recognizing, that you have the right to vote, but that you have to exercise that right. And so, getting people excited about it and letting them know that their vote actually matters. I think that was, this election more than anything reminded people and showed people and validated to people that not just that we've had to fight for our right to vote, but that vote actually matters.
Janiah, what's your opinion on this right and this privilege as you look forward to your first time casting a ballot?
Yes, so I haven't been able to vote yet. I still am looking forward to it. And also to kind of reiterate what he said, when the 15th Amendment was passed, a lot of people, it's like giving people the right to vote, but also putting all these obstacles in their way so they can't exercise it. So as you said, through the poll taxes and the literary tests and the grandfather clause, basically a lot of Black people during the time, they weren't able to read or write. They weren't able to have money to pay to vote. So just fighting through all those things that they fought through so that I would be able to have the right when I turn 18 to vote and exercise it is something that makes me think, it's such an important thing that people vote, because the way that we can show our gratitude to the people who fought for us is by exercising the right to vote, since they worked so hard for it.
Justice Page, please share your thoughts about this question.
Well, we are a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And if people are to have power in the system that we have, the only way to do that is through your casting your ballot. And so for me, it's about having a voice and giving yourself control over what government is, what it does, what it says. Because the reality is that government's actions, they do it in our name. And the only way we can control that is to exercise our constitutional right to participate in that process.
Justice Page, let me follow up on that particular point. As an attorney, as a judge, and as a Supreme Court justice for the state of Minnesota, it's often been your job and responsibility to protect this right. So can you say something about some of the tactics that have been used to restrict the rights and how important the law has been and lawyers like yourself to protect people's rights to exercise this privilege?
Well, we mentioned them earlier, the poll tax, literacy tests, and those were used to deny people who were poor with a disproportionate impact on African Americans. The poll tax was a way to keep people from voting. Literacy tests. Well, if we don't provide an educational system that will allow them to become literate, and then we require them to take a test to show how literate they are, it's another vehicle to exclude people. The courts have determined that those tests, those taxes are unconstitutional. So today we've moved to voter identification. It is just another vehicle under the guise of preventing voter fraud, which by every measure that I've seen, every objective measure that I've seen, is maybe not non-existent, but as close to it as we can probably get. It becomes a tool to prevent people from voting. It, on its face, you think, well, voter identification, it's really race neutral. Well, the fact is, it may be race neutral, but it has a disparate impact. And that is disparate impact denies people the right to exercise their franchise.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that. I was just reading something a couple of weeks ago, which said that 10% of Americans do not have IDs, but that number is about 25% within the African American community. Chris, I want to turn to you because you mentioned that you live in Georgia, and Georgia has, in the last couple of weeks and months, been in the news a lot around this issue of voting and access to the vote. What are some of the means of voter intimidation and voter suppression that you've seen in Georgia over the last couple of months? And this is an ongoing issue, so if you could tell us a little bit more about what's going on today.
I think it's a great question. I think what you saw is, as I talked about earlier, that Stacey Abrams did a great job of really bringing the message more to our community, more canvassing directly to our community. And because of COVID, we had to really look at how people were voting, the access to voting, be it with early voting. I live right downtown in Atlanta, and the Hawks did a tremendous job of opening up the arena for voting that allowed greater access. I think a lot of people saw Georgia in the primary election looking like a hot mess. I think that's to say it very lightly in terms of the new voting machines and the lines, and just the whole process was terrible. And there was a lot of work that was done to make sure that didn't happen again, along with realizing that having the space and the access were critical to that. So much so that, again, the Hawks and even the Falcons in this last election, the special election, they were able to open up their facilities. So I think when you look at it, there's always been those attempts. I think the biggest thing really comes down to educating people about the process. The date being on a Tuesday has been something that has made it hard for certain people, just by the date, limits in early voting, the location of those sites. So a lot of those things came to a head this past election, and really there was a lot of opportunity. I think that's why you saw that the turnout was so much greater. So kind of combined with ways of trying to push people down, there was this great emphasis of really understanding that your vote mattered. So this year, more than anything, I think there was this huge campaign of saying that your vote mattered more than before too. So,
right, Janiah, earlier you talked about some of the restrictions that had existed in the 1800s, and I wonder who are some of the people who've inspired you and helped you realize the significance of voting. If there's some people that you want to draw attention to that have been important to you around these civil rights issues?
A woman who has been important to me is Fannie Lou Hamer. She worked a lot with voting rights. She was a voting rights activist and a women's rights activist. And when she had a job, she was going with some others to register to vote. And she went to exercise her right to vote, and she was fired from her job because of it. And she continued to make her own progress and her own things for the African American community by, educating others and helping others get their right and exercise their rights to vote, in the community.
How about you, Justice Page? Anybody you want to make mention of who sort of inspired you, or someone else that we should look to as a role model and someone we should look up to around the issue of voting?
Well, I was 19 years old in 1964. And in the summer of 1964, James Chaney, Andrew Goodwin, Michael Schwerner gave their lives so that I could have the opportunity to vote. In March of 1965, Viola Luiso gave her life so that I could have the opportunity to vote. That's how important this is to me. We talk about the importance of voting. These people gave the last full measure so that we could have the opportunity to participate. And I will never forget those people, because it is on their backs that we stand. And the people before them who gave their lives. They're the ones that inspire me to do the things that I do.
Well, thank you. That's really powerful. Chris, you mentioned Stacey Abrams, who is a person who's involved in voting today, who's demonstrated a lot of the characteristics that Janiah and Justice Page have sort of mentioned regarding people in the past. What are some of the characteristics and qualities that you see in Stacey Abrams as she helps lead this fight today?
Yeah, that's a great question. Stacey lost the governorship in a close election to Governor Kemp, and instead of just getting mad about it, she's there. There were certain voter irregularities that she could have easily just got mad and just got angry and said, and it just hated the system. The system's wrong. It's all messed up. But instead, what she did was engage it. She saw that there was something that was wrong. She saw that there were people that could have spoke up, that maybe their voices were not heard. And she said, how can I take away the things that are in their way so that everybody's voice can be heard, so everybody's vote can be heard, and went to the streets. And I think that's where you see her embodied in the late John Lewis, who was my congressman here in Atlanta, who was on the Edmund Pettus Bridge and got his head busted open, and along with all of those people that were there. And I think it's so important that we see that the leaders, that they're nothing without the people that they inspire. And so Stacey Abrams has been able to inspire a number of people, and really more with the grace of accepting her loss, but then the diligence of really saying, what do we need to change the system, and working with the system to move forward. And then we saw, the fruits of that labor with this last election.
Thank you. One of the things that Chris as a former professional football player, is that sports have been so essential to your own personal development. You've talked about this. And so a lot of the qualities that you attribute to Stacey Abrams are the type of characteristics that we read about and learn about in the character playbook. So if you could sort of tie what we're learning as a group here today and how it relates to these values and ideas. I'd really like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, you asked a question on, just the last question was, what do people want to learn? And, perseverance was one of those. How do we, voting rights movement, what was key to, kind of changing the course? Perseverance, resilience, empathy, standing up for what is right. So there's a self-discipline, there's focus, there's energy, there's acceptance. Right now we just saw the Super Bowl and the Kansas City Chiefs got whooped. I mean, let's just keep it real. And they have to own the fact that they got beat, be honest about how they got beat so that they can now make corrections so that they can be a team. And I think, so much of what has gone on is that we've had people that have not accepted their situation, having not accepted, where they were at, and they had to chip away at it and not think that it was just going to absolutely change tomorrow, but realize if they were willing to put the work in, if they were willing to put together a strong team and stay focused on the goals, that they could eventually get there.
Thank you. Janiah, I want to ask this next question to you. One of the things I've often thought about in my own life as I've learned and studied about the civil rights movement is what would I have done back then? And the interesting thing is now I feel like I'm getting an opportunity to kind of live through it and to respond to those questions. I wonder if I would have been a part of the NAACP, if I would have been inspired to go to law school or to contribute to some of these legal efforts, or if I wonder if I would have been someone who was on the front line of the protest and out in the streets with signs and things of that nature. I wonder if I was someone who would have written checks to organizations and helped bail out people, if I would have written letters and organized, if I would have given speeches. And so it's been interesting to play my role right now, particularly as a historian. My role as a curator is it allows me to help people understand the context of the earlier period to help people understand the current moment. And so I feel like I'm getting an opportunity to help educate, to teach, to help prepare people for what it is that they are engaged in. For you, if you think about the civil rights movement, who inspired you and what do you think your role is in this current moment as we fight for greater rights and access and opportunities?
Well, one person who inspires me is John Lewis, and he was a part of the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And I think it's important to see that youth were a part of the civil rights movement because a lot of people, when they see history, they see adults. So I think it's very important to show teens and children that youth were a part of the civil rights movement, which means that they can make change in, for the future, how they want it to be, and in the present, how they want it to be. And I feel my role is, talking to people about the inequalities in society, as you said, sharing history and educating others on how the past still affects our present, and just inspiring others to research more and know that they can do anything.
Oh, great. Can you tell us about the t-shirt you're wearing today too?
The t-shirt I'm wearing, oh, one second. The t-shirt I'm wearing is from my business, Slay It Proud. And through my business on my social medias, I share Black history and teach others about, the inequalities in society. And through my t-shirts, I try to empower people.
Great. Justice Page, the last question goes to you. Why is it important to understand how voting has evolved throughout American history in order for us to understand what we're witnessing today, particularly in the most recent elections?
Before I get to your question, let me just add a couple of characteristics that I think are important. One is the willingness to act, and two is courage. Those two things, along with the others that were mentioned, I think are what we need, what we had then, and what we need today to go forward. Why, if we're going to change the future, we have to be able to voice what it is that we seek. And in this political system that we have, the most effective way to have our voice heard is through the ballot. There are those that might argue that the ballot doesn't always work. Well, it doesn't always get you what you want. But when the choice is effectively between the ballot and the bullet, if we're going to be a civilization, we have to exercise the power that we have. And that power is in casting our vote, having our voice heard, having our leaders do what we seek, as opposed to doing what they choose. They represent us, and it is through our collective voices that we get heard.
Thank you. What an inspiring and encouraging and illuminating conversation. I want you to thank our panelists for being involved in helping us understand the history and why it still matters. I hope that you'll come back with us next week on February 16th, next Tuesday, the same time, 1 p.m., where we'll have another panel involving professional athletes, political leaders, and community organizers as we talk about and discuss how athletes have used their platform to mobilize for voter education and voter registration. Want to give our panelists another opportunity to share their platforms if students and teachers want to follow them or reach out to them. Let's start with Janiah.
You can follow me and my business at Slay It Proud on Instagram and Facebook. And you can also visit my website at www.slayitproud.com, where I sell t-shirts like this. And I also have my own Black History children's coloring book.
Chris.
You can follow me at Chris Draft, Twitter, Chris Draft, Instagram, Team Draft. You can see the work that we're doing in Cantor, Chris Draft Family Foundation, the work that we're doing with families to live healthy lifestyles. And then I have to just say, it was such a pleasure to be here with Justice Page. I am a huge fan. And thank you, Janiah. Thank you, Damion, and the United Way and Everfi staff for putting this together.
Justice Page.
You can follow what I do at page-ed.org. That's the website for the Page Education Foundation, where you can also find the 4 children's books that I've had the pleasure of co-authoring with my daughter, Alan, and his Perfectly Pointy and Possibly Perpendicular Pinky. The Invisible You, Grandpa Allen's Sugar Shack, and our most recent book, Be Love, Can Be Hard. And thank you all for putting this on. It is so critical that we all understand that we have power. And one of the ways to exercise that power is through the ballot.
Thank you all for being here. And I hope all of you watching and listening will come visit me here in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. Thank you so much for being here with us today.